Today we are diving into a moment in history that I find completely mind-blowing. A single mission that perfectly encapsulates why World War II ended the way it did. This is the story of the day the American nightmare flew over Tokyo and the Japanese realized that every defensive assurance their commanders had given them was an absolute lie. I want you to think about the date, April 7th, 1945. The war is still raging, but the battle lines are closing in on the Japanese homeland. The Japanese high command is absolutely confident in one fundamental thing. Distance is their final defense. They know the B-29 superfortresses are hitting them hard, but they've told their pilots and their people repeatedly that no American single-engine fighter can possibly reach the home islands from the bases they hold in the Pacific. It's a physical impossibility. It's simply too far. Then, at dawn over Tokyo Bay, that lie is exposed. 91 North American P-51D Mustangs, the legendary fighter, are approaching the point. These are planes from the 15th and 21st Fighter Groups. 91 of them. Not one or two on a daring suicide run, but a massive formation. This is a deployment of industrial firepower over a distance that military planners just 2 years prior had officially deemed impossible for any single engine fighter. We are talking about 750-mile open ocean flight, a distance that's equivalent to flying from Los Angeles to a Little Rock in Arkansas, entirely over featureless water, just to get to the fight, and then having to fly all the way back. That is crazy, even by modern standards for a piston engine plane. Imagine you are Major James B. Tubb, sitting in that cockpit. You got the control stick firmly in your hand. You are looking down, and there it is, the Mount Fuji, majestic, snow-capped, and utterly unmistakable, serving as your primary navigation marker. The irony is just fantastic. It's a sacred, majestic landmark meant to symbolize the strength and permanence of the empire is being used by the enemy as a simple point of navigation chart. Below you, the morning sun is casting shadows across the Japanese countryside, rice fields, villages, military installations, none of which had ever seen an American fighter before. The mission, as simple as it sounds, is unprecedented. Escort the B-29 superfortresses deep into the Japanese homeland. At 7 a.m., the Japanese interceptors are scrambled. More than 100 of them converge on the American formation, and through the morning haze, the sight hits them. Single-engine American fighters over Tokyo. The shock is utterly devastating. Their commanders, their entire defensive strategy was based on the assurance that this couldn't happen. The Japanese pilots, seeing the P-51s, must have felt the cold certainty that the war was truly lost right then and there. These aren't some temporary carrier-based Navy fighters that have a limited range and have to retreat quickly. These are land-based Army Air Force fighters, acting as if they own the sky 750 miles from their base. And this isn't just a tactical failure, it's psychological collapse. Flight Sergeant Totelemizu, a Ki-84 hired pilot, later recalled his disbelief. When they were scrambled, he assumed they meant bombers. Maybe a carrier raid, but definitely not fighters. When he actually saw the P-51s, he thought he must be dreaming. He said it was impossible. Our commanders had assured us no American fighter could reach Japan from their island bases. And when they did, he knew the war was truly lost. The Japanese defense was led by some great planes like the Nakajima K-84 hired the Frank. This was their fastest and most advanced fighter, designed to try and outclimb and outmaneuver the P-51 and P-47 Thunderbolts at a certain speeds and altitudes. But what happens next in the skies over Tokyo perfectly demonstrates the vast technological and industrial gulf between the two nations, and why American industrial might had produced what many pilots truly called the perfect long-range fighter aircraft. The North American PD-51 Mustang arrived in the Pacific already carrying the reputation it had forged over Europe, where it had systematically broken the back of the Luftwaffe and made daylight bombing possible. Its very existence was a success story of international collaboration. It was originally developed for export to Britain, and it only became the legend it is when the British wisely modified the early models to use the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. That marriage, American aerodynamics innovation fused with British engine technology, created a masterpiece. And the American-built version, the Packard V16507, was a licensed-built Rolls-Royce Merlin 66, and it was the heart of the VLR mission. This engine delivered 1,695 horsepower at takeoff and sometimes rising to 1,720 horsepower in emergency war power settings using water injection. But the real secret wasn't just the raw power, it was the engineering, and the engine was a two-stage, two-speed supercharged power plant. This allowed it to maintain extremely high performance at altitudes where Japanese engines, with the simple single-stage supercharged, were literally gasping for air, unable to compress the thin atmosphere sufficiently. The result, the P-51D flew to a maximum speed of about 440 miles per hour at 25,000 feet, and its operating ceiling reached almost 42,000 feet. That altitude capability was not just impressive, it was decisive. Now let's talk about the mathematics of firepower, because this is where you really see the American doctrine of abundance come into play. The Mustang was armed with 6 wing-mounted 0.5-inch M2 Browning machine guns. These guns fired at 800 rounds per minute per gun. Do the math. That means the P-51D could deliver 4,800 rounds per minute of concentrated, armor-piercing, incendiary fire power. That's 80 rounds per second. Each armor-piercing incendiary round was a small projectile weighing 46 grams, traveling at an incredible 2,900 feet per second. This delivered tremendous kinetic energy on impact, perfectly capable of penetrating aircraft armor, igniting fuel tanks, and destroying an engine with just a few well-placed hits. And the capacity. Early model P-51Ds carried a total of 2,800 rounds. Later variants reduced this slightly to 1,880 rounds for improved readability. But think about that number, 1,880 rounds of concentrated destruction. By the end of 1944, the superiority of this aircraft was so clear that 14 of the 15 fighter squadrons in the US, 8 Air Force in Europe were composed of Mustangs. It was a total undeniable endorsement of the aircraft's performance over all other available fighters. This deployment reflects American industrial capability at its peak. The assembly lines were running 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. North American aviation factories in Inglewood, California and Dallas, Texas were churning out P-51s at a rate that simply staggered the imagination. At peak production, a new Mustang rolled off the assembly line every hour. Think about that. Every single hour. By the end of the war, over 15,500 P-51s of all variants would be manufactured, with the D model alone accounting for over 8,100 aircraft. That single model's production run was more than Japan's total production of all fighter types in the last 2 years of the war combined. And that's not a war, that's an industrial tsunami. The VLR capability, the very long range, was the thing that truly changed the mathematics of the air warfare in the Pacific. With the dual 110-gallon drop tanks, the Mustangs were routinely flying 1,500-mile round trips. A feat pilots sometimes pushed to 1,600 miles. And the secret to this achievement lay in two factors. Now, first, the Merlin engine is exceptional fuel efficiency at cruise settings, sipping fuel at just 65 gallons per hour at economical cruise. Now, second, the P-51's revolutionary laminar flow wing design. This wing, developed by North American aerodynamics Edgar Schmude, reduced drag by astounding 35% compared to conventional airfoils. It worked by maintaining smooth airflow over a much greater percentage of the wing surface, delaying the transition to turbulent flow and dramatically reducing parasitic drag. Less drag plus a super efficient engine equals impossible range. Now let's look at the enemy's best effort, the Nakayama Ki-84 Hyatt, or Frank. It entered operational service with the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service in June 1944. Too late and in too few numbers to truly affect the war's outcome. It was generally considered the best Japanese fighter to operate in large numbers during the conflict. But what Japan considered as mass production, America would consider prototype runs. The Ki-84 boosted high speed and it was great to maneuver, armed with up to 2 30mm Ho 155 cannons and two 20mm Ho 5 cannons, giving it formidable firepower on paper. But here's the reality check. Remember the Mustang's ammunition count? The 30mm cannons on the Ki-84 carried only 50 rounds per gun, and the 20mm cannons just 150 rounds per gun, for a total ammunition load only of 400 rounds for its cannons and machine guns combined. That is 5 to 7 times less ammunition than the Mustang. The Japanese pilot had to be perfect every time, while the American could afford short corrective bursts. On paper, the Ki-84 was competitive, maybe even superior in some maneuvers, powered by the Nakayama Hei 45 Homer 18-cylinder radial engine, theoretically rated at 2,000 horsepower. But the reality of the late war Japanese production tells a dramatically different story. One of the collapsing quality, desperate improvisation, and systematic failure. Pilots and crews in the field learned that quickly. The Ki-84's high-performance Homer engine and its landing gear were fragile. The engine, while advanced, suffered from chronic reliability problems that worsened as Japanese factories under constant B-29 bombardment lacked quality steel and aluminium and could no longer maintain the precise tolerances required. The landing gear was another common failure point. Many landing gear units were compromised by the poor quality heat treatment of the late war Japanese steel, often containing impurities that made proper hardening impossible, and as a result, many Hayatis suffered strut collapses on landing, writing off irreplaceable aircraft and killing pilots who had taken months to train. While American factories maintained consistent quality standards despite massive production volumes, actually improving quality as production techniques were refined, Japanese manufacturing just constantly deteriorated. This meant pilots never knew how their individual aircraft would perform. Would the brakes actually work? Would the engine hold together at high power settings? And could it even climb high enough to intercept the B-29s at 30,000 feet? By 1945, they only had produced 3,514 Ki-84s in total, and many of these were grounded due to the lack of spare parts, fuel, or qualified pilots. Perhaps only half of those could be considered truly combat-ready at any given time. The fuel situation alone revealed the strategic catastrophe. American pilots flew with 100-octane aviation gasoline shipped from refineries in Texas and California, specifically formulated for high-performance engines. Now, Japanese pilots were forced to make do with whatever could be produced domestically or synthesized from coal. Late war Japanese fuel often tested at 87 octane or lower, sometimes dipping as low as 80 octane. This low quality fuel robbed the engines of power and caused pre-ignition that literally destroyed cylinders, pistons, and valves. Some desperate units facing the existential threat of the American advance were attempting to supplement their fuel with pine root extracted oils from stumps, alcohol from sweet potatoes, and even steak production byproducts. I want you to let that sink in for a moment. They were fighting the most powerful air force in the world, and they were fueling the best fighter with alcohol byproducts from a sweet potato. Pilots reported engines that barely started, ran rough at power settings, and often failed catastrophically in flights. Now back to the mission on the April 7th. The Mustangs formed up with their charges, 103 Boeing B-29 Super Fortresses, each carrying tons of bombs. Captain Art Bridge of the 45th Fighter Squadron recalled the B-29s as looking like a school of a giant silverfish swimming through the sky. The rendezvous itself was a triumph of navigation. The P-51s had flown 750 miles over open ocean, navigating primarily by dead reckoning and basic radio compass, timing their arrival within minutes of Bombardier's schedule. They had climbed gradually from sea level to 25,000 feet, their advanced engine automatically adjusting mixture and their two-stage superchargers seamlessly transitioning from low to high blower to maintain the power. Crossing the coast of Honshua, the P-51 pilots dropped their 110-gallon wing tanks, the tanks tumbling to the earth, some exploding as they hit the ground. Immediately, more than 100 Japanese interceptors scrambled from airfields around Tokyo. As Major Tapp tore into the formation, his combat report described the engagement with clinical precision. The Japanese came in the traditional three-plane shot formation, but their coordination was poor. The flight leader would commit to an attack, but his wingman often failed to follow through. Tapp noted they seemed hesitant, perhaps low on fuel or ammunition, or simply inexperienced. The Mustangs dove through with the 100 mile per hour speed advantage, fired quick bursts, and zoom climbed back to altitude before the Japanese could react. This breakdown in Japanese tactical coordination reflected the catastrophic crisis in pilot training. By 1945, most experienced Japanese pilots were simply dead. Replacements were receiving as little as 50 hours of flight training before being thrown into combat, compared to 600 hours American pilots received before deploying. When the smoke cleared on that first mission, the Sunsetters of the 7th Fighter Command were credited with 26 Japanese planes destroyed for the cost of 2 P-51s and 1 pilot. That 13-to-1 kill ratio would only improve as American pilots gained experience and Japanese pilot quality continued to deteriorate, reaching a 20-to-1 or even 30-to-1 in later weeks. The performance differential was stark, especially in the vertical fight. About 2,000 feet, the P-51D was unbeatable. The two-stage supercharger delivered dense, oxygen-rich air, maintaining sea level power. The Ki-84's single-stage system caused power to drop off dramatically. At 30,000 feet, the Ki-84 was barely maintaining 350 miles per hour, while the P-51D was still hitting 420 miles per hour. Lieutenant Jerry Yellen, who flew these missions, vividly described seeing the Japanese climbing up, leaving dark exhaust trails as they firewalled the throttles. But by 25,000 feet, he said, they were wallowing like fish out of the water. Their engines were smoking and struggling. The Mustangs would dive through with the 650 calibers blazing, and the Japanese simply couldn't match the speed in the dive or the zoom climb afterwards. The P-51D could dive at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour and maintain control, built as it was for the high-stress flight. Japanese flighters often experience control reversal or structural failure at speeds above 400 miles per hour in a dive, their wings prone to tearing off. The quality gap was immense. American pilots had 400 to 600 hours of flight time, extensive gunnery practice, and training in all weather conditions. Japanese pilots often had less than 100 hours total time, and sometimes as little as 30, with minimal gunnery practice due to the ammunition shortages. They were learning deflection shooting for the first time in the actual combat. The navigation challenge required a confidence born of experience and trust in the machine and the support system. American pilots had detailed weather briefings, accurate maps, and functioning, precisely manufactured instruments. They had rescue submarines, the Lifeguard League, and PBY Catalina flying boats stationed along the route. Japanese pilots flew with unreliable compasses, outdated maps, and virtually no hope of rescue if downed over the water. Their life raft often leaking and their emergency rations long consumed. This entire operation, from the navigation precision to the staggering combat performance, was underpinned by American logistics, a contest between American abundance and Japanese scarcity. Each VLR mission consumed 57,000 gallons of high-octane fuel and carried 230,000 rounds of ammunition. This required a constant flow of fuel, ammunition, and parts, delivered by Liberty ships built at a rate of 3 per day, and C-54 transport aircraft flying regular cargo routes. Japanese logistics, meanwhile, had collapsed. Aviation fuel was so scarce that training fights were cancelled. Ammunition was rationed even for combat missions. The Navy and Army Air Forces were desperately competing for dwelling resources. Aircraft were cannibalized and entire fighter groups were grounded for a lack of tires, spark plugs, or hydraulic fluid. The technological gap extended to pilot survival. American pilots wore G-suit to prevent blackouts, used standardized, reliable oxygen systems, and communicated via clear VHF radios. Japanese pilots often flew without functioning radios, used unreliable oxygen systems that failed about 20,000 feet, and had no G-suits, severely limiting their ability to maneuver aggressively. We established that the first mission on April 7, 1945 was a strategic, technological, and psychological bombshell. The Japanese defense was based on the lie that distance would protect them, and the Mustang blew that lie out of the sky. Now I want to talk about the brutal reality for the pilots, the sheer logistics of American abundance versus Japanese scarcity, and how the industrial mathematics of the war became an undeniable death sentence for the Japanese Air Force. First, let's address the human factor in these very long range or VLR missions. While the P-51 was a magnificent piece of engineering, flying it on a 1,500-mile round trip over the Pacific was not a joy ride. It was an epic test of endurance. Major James B. Tapp, who flew these missions, said it clearly. Fighting the Japanese was the adrenaline rush, but simply getting from point A to point B was the hardest part. Imagine being strapped into a single-engine fighter for 8 hours or more. That is 8 straight hours of fighting, fatigue, anxiety, and the physical torment of the G suit, the oxygen mask, and the cramped space. The Pacific Ocean, once you got past the horizon of Iwo Jima, became endless, featureless, and hypnotic. You had to constantly fight the urge to zone out, constantly check your compass, and wonder if you would make a navigational error. One mechanical failure, one engine hiccup, and your life raft was your only hope, assuming that the lifeguard submarine was in your reach. For the pilot, the mission was a test of confidence in his machine and his support system, a confidence that the American infrastructure fostered and the Japanese infrastructure completely failed to provide. The Mustang's design actually helped mitigate some of this pain, and these details are important. Its cockpit ergonomics, refined through years of combat reports, were superior. You had a bubble canopy that gave you 360-degree visibility, a literal life-saving advantage in combat. The seat was adjustable, the rudder pedals moved, and the controls were logically placed to minimize fatigue during those marathon flights. Contrast that with the Japanese Ki-84 cockpit, which still suffered from poor rear visibility and awkwardly placed controls that forced the pilot to take a hand off the stick at critical moments. In an 8-hour mission, these small design differences add up to the difference between effective combat and total exhaustion. The superiority of the ornament also hinged on reliability and volume, not just size. While the Japanese had cannons, the P-51D's 650 caliber machine guns were extraordinarily reliable, with stoppage rates below 1% when properly maintained. They carried that massive ammunition load up to 2,800 rounds. American pilots could afford to take sighting shots, engage multiple targets, and fire in short, concentrated bursts without the paralyzing fear of running dry after a few seconds of firing. The ballistics of the 50 caliber rounds were also incredibly stable and well understood, allowing American pilots to reliably engage targets at 400 yards. Japanese pilots with a mixed armament of cannons and machine guns simply struggled with different ballistic trajectories. It made accurate shooting beyond close range a virtual impossibility. The biggest gap, however, was in gunnery training. American pilots had fired thousands of rounds in practice. They learned deflection shooting, aiming where the enemy plane will be, not where it is now, until it was indistinctive. They practiced on toed sleeves and used camera guns in mock dogfights. Japanese pilots in 1945 were lucky to fire 100 rounds in training. Ammunition was too scarce. Many of the young pilots going up were trying to learn deflecting shooting for the very first time, while an experienced American ace was lining up on their tail. The navigation challenge itself was a massive hurdle that separated the competent from the doomed. These 1,500-mile round trips over the vast ocean required a kind of trust in technology that the Americans had and the Japanese simply lacked. American pilots flew with the detailed weather briefings compiled from submarine reports, accurate maps updated from the photos, and instruments manufactured to precise specifications. They had rescue submarines, the lifeguard leagues, and the PBY Catalina flying boats stationed along the route, a safety net that saved dozens of downed airmen. Now, Japanese pilots flew with unreliable compasses, often outdated maps, and almost no hope of rescue if they ditched over the water. Their life rafts, if they even had them, often leaked, and their emergency rations were frequently consumed due to the food shortages on the ground. The simple knowledge that rescue was possible installed a confidence that was absent in the Japanese cockpit. There was one devastating moment, though, where the mission pushed men and machines to the limit, and American technology could not defy nature itself. On June 1st, 1945, the Mustang men called it a Black Friday. Around 150 Mustangs en route to Osaka flew in a blinding frontal system that weather forecasts had failed to predict. 27 aircraft were lost in minutes, 24 of them due to the weather, not enemy action. Pilots became disorientated in towering cumulus clouds, flew into each other, or ran out of the fuel trying to find clear air. The weather front extended from sea level to 40,000 feet, bringing violent turbulence, icing conditions, and zero visibility. Pilots reported St. Elmo's fire dancing on their wings and their artificial horizons tumbling uselessly. This disaster was a harsh reminder that even with the superior technology, the VLR missions demanded everything from the pilots. Despite that loss, the overall impact on Japanese morale was catastrophic and irreversible. Captain Yoshio Yoshida, a Japanese pilot, wrote in his diary that the appearance of American fighters over the Tokyo had shattered our confidence completely. They had been promised that the B-29s were vulnerable without escort. Now they were seeing Mustangs flying over the palace itself, strafing airfields in a broad daylight, shooting down their best pilots. Yoshida concluded that the sight of those Mustangs, so confident and so numerous, told them what their leaders would not. The war is lost, and we are simply waiting to die. The strategic impact was clear. The P-51s meant the B-29s could bomb in the daylight without escort, leading to greater accuracy and the systematic destruction of Japan's industrial infrastructure. The psychological effect was equally devastating. Japanese civilians could see American fighters strafing airfields and shipping in the Tokyo Bay, making it undeniable that Japan had lost control of its own airspace. The myth that the divine wind would protect Japan was shattered when American fighters flew freely over the imperial palace. Lieutenant Colonel John R. Morgan, flying a modified P-51D on the assistance missions, confirmed the extent of the collapse. He reported flying over the airfields that intelligence claimed held hundreds of aircraft, only to find maybe a dozen flyable planes. The rest were just engines and propellers, parts removed, simply aluminium skeletons cannibalized for parts. He noted the Japanese tried to deceive the Americans by pushing wrecks around to make it look like they had more operational aircraft for the photos. Some airfields even had fake wooden aircraft complete with painted markings, trying to draw American attacks away from the few real planes they had hidden. By August 10, 1945, when the Mustangs flew their last aerial combat, claiming 7 final kills near Tokyo, Japanese resistance had become token. Fuel shortages were so severe that most Japanese fighters were grounded. Their tanks drained the fuel to desperate kamikaze units. The few pilots who did fly were often teenagers with a minimal training. In total, the Iwo Jima Mustangs were credited with 206 Japanese airplanes shot down between April and August 1945, and that is a staggering 75% of the total Pacific P-51 aerial victories. The actual number of destroyed Japanese aircraft was probably much higher, with the wreckage over the home islands often unconfirmed. This brings us to the final argument, the industrial mathematics. These numbers tell the story of the war in stark, crushing detail. The United States produced 15,586 P-51s of all variants during the war. That single number is greater than Japan's total production of all aircraft types in 1944 and 1945 combined. Japan produced approximately 3,500 Ki-84s, many of which were destroyed on the ground by B-29 raids or grounded for lack of parts. North American aviation alone was producing 20 P-51s per day at peak production. Let me repeat that. 20 planes every day. That is more than Japan produced Ki-84s in an entire month. Each American aircraft was essentially identical with interchangeable parts thanks to the consistent quality standards. Now, Japanese aircraft again varied wildly in quality and performance due to the collapse of their manufacturing sector. The training pipeline numbers confirm the advantage. By 1945, the United States was training 30,000 pilots annually, each receiving hundreds of hours of flight and combat instructions. Japan's program had completely collapsed, with the new pilots receiving perhaps 50 hours of flight time before being assigned to operational units. The mathematics of attrition were absolute. America could replace losses while maintaining quality. Japan could not replace losses even by lowering its standards dramatically. The fuel logistics illustrates the strategic end game. Each P-51 mission consumed approximately 600 gallons of 100-octane fuel per aircraft. A daily operation of 100 Mustangs meant 60,000 gallons per day for just one fighter group. American tankers were delivering millions of gallons of high-octane fuel monthly across the Pacific, an unceasing logistical flow. Meanwhile, Japanese fuel was so scarce it was being rationed for the final doomed kamikaze effort. The P-51 VLR missions over Japan were the final total manifestation of American industrial and technological dominance. They demonstrated a willingness to build a plane, an engine, and supply chain that defied the limitations of the geography and military doctrine. The Mustang was not just a superior fighter, it was a physical symbol of a nation's overwhelming productive power. The myth of Japanese invulnerabilities was completely shattered, not by a single bomb, but by the relentless, organized, and unceasing flow of production that the P-51s perfectly embodied. This story, from the two-stage supercharged to the 20 planes a day, is why the war ended the way it did. And if you found this deep dive into the sheer crushing mathematics of the air war over Japan as mind-blowing as I did, please do me a favor, like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next breakdown of history's most unbelievable moments. I'm curious to hear from you. Which single factor, the Merlin engine, the laminar flow wing, or the unbelievable production rate, do you think was the most decisive reason the Mustang was able to break the Japanese will to fight? Let me know in the comments.